To be fair, moving on is hard, but it's often very necessary. So I'm back. Sorry I've been missing for a little while, but I had a couple of life things going on that I'm going to dig a little deeper into on my Thursday YouTube video. But for today, I'm going to talk about moving on, since this was a video that was requested of me a few weeks ago and I kind of let it backlag. So let's get into that. When moving on from someone or something, a lot of times we struggle because people, for the most part, like to stay in situations that offer comfort and familiarity. And it can be hard to just do something new once you've built up a flow or a continuous situation that you're used to. But it makes no sense to stay in a situation that's toxic and ultimately doesn't help or benefit anyone in the situation. So these are a few steps that I use when I'm looking to move on from something or someone that doesn't necessarily feed my growth anymore. The number one thing that I do is I allow myself to be sad or acknowledge the hurt that I'm feeling about the situation. You can't begin to release that pain if you don't acknowledge that it exists. There's no pretending like you're fine and smiling. No, give yourself time to, in a sense, grieve. Yell, cry, scream, get angry, whatever you need to do to let yourself know that you have feelings and you feel that pain. Don't deny yourself that time. Don't take too much time, but definitely don't deny yourself that time. The second thing I do is that I allow myself to be honest with myself. And that means that I take responsibility for my part in the situation. I don't care what situation you're in, it takes two or more people to make it bad or good or whatever. So you have to acknowledge your part in that and be honest about it. You know, you can't pretend like everything falls on the opposite parties and that you were just an innocent bystander. Nothing works like that. And as long as you think like that, you're allowing yourself not to grow and you're allowing yourself to be bitter and jaded by the end of the whole situation. The third thing I would do, if given the opportunity, is to be direct and non-confrontational. If you're lucky, whatever it is that you have to let go of for whatever reason, you might get the opportunity to talk to that person or persons and let them know how you feel and how they made you feel. But when you have this conversation, it's important that you are upfront and direct about how you feel, about how you felt, without being confrontational. It's a delicate balance, but it can be achieved because the purpose is to talk about and analyze the relationship or the situation so that you both learn from it. But it's not to sit there and point the blame at each other because nothing gets resolved and you don't take in the whole effect of it. I know this can be hard because when we get our heart broken, we just want to go off on people and tell them how they made us feel. But understand that there's no real growth or change in that. And it doesn't really stick to the person if all you want to do is yell and point the finger. You want them to understand. But if you're yelling, chances are they're going to cut it off and not even really hear you. That doesn't work. The fourth thing that I do is I forgive. Now, regardless of whether you get to do step number 3 and actually confront and talk to the person or you don't, you still have to forgive. And what forgiveness does is it releases you from the pain and the anguish or the extra feelings, because honestly, at the point where it's over, there's really nothing that it can change. Everything that went wrong in the early stages of whatever the situation is has already happened. You can't change that. So you need to forgive and move on. If you don't forgive and move on, again, you open yourself up to this bitterness that keeps you at bay and keeps you from growing. Also, if you do reach out to the person and they don't respond back or don't want to have a conversation, which sometimes happens, you can't stay mad or reach out and say, I wanted to be the adult, but you don't want to talk and blah, blah, blah. Let it go, especially if you don't want this person to be a part of your life anymore. It doesn't make sense to keep harping on that fact if you're just trying to move on with your life anyway. If you get the conversation, fine. If you don't, that's cool too. Just forgive and move on at that point. The fifth thing I would do is I would be observant or take out what I learned from the situation. This is somewhat similar to 2, but it's a little bit more detailed. In the second point, it's mostly about calming yourself down and taking responsibility. In this point, I want you to reflect on everything as a whole and take what you've learned from it. So if it's a relationship, take all the things that you loved about the relationship and all the things you hated about it, and really piece it together so that you know what you're willing to deal with and what you're not willing to deal with in your next relationship. This is so important. I cannot stress how important this is, because you don't want to keep repeating the same mistakes. You're only going to find yourself doing that if you don't take the time to break apart what actually happened in the situation and learn from it. So be observant and pay attention and learn from your mistakes and from your accomplishments, what worked, and take that and apply that to the next situation. The last thing that I do is I move on with a positive outlook. It is not fair to bring whatever situation you had previously into a new one. That goes for relationships, jobs, all of this stuff. If you left that person in the past, you have to leave that hurt in the past. So with each new relationship or situation or job, whatever it is that you're moving on from and to, you need to go in there with a clear head. Now, mind you, with the fifth step, you're taking in everything that you've learned and observed about the relationships, things you like, the things you love or hated, and you acknowledge it. You don't lower your standards for anybody, but at the same time, you give them a chance to show you things that you don't like. Don't assume that they're going to disappoint you. Don't go into any new situation with disappointment already hanging over your head as if everybody you be or everything you do after the one situation is just going to be the same. Because if you do that, you're failing from the start, because you're manifesting pain and disappointment from the beginning. Now, what I'm going to do is actually take the steps that I mentioned and give you an example of how I had to use them in a situation. It's going to be a relationship from my past that I'm going to break down for you. So when things started to fall apart in that relationship and I knew it was getting time for us to move on and go our separate ways, the first thing I did is just like the step that I mentioned before. I let myself be hurt. Now, there's no definite amount of time that you should let yourself be hurt or whatnot. For me, that process took 2 weeks, because the relationship I was in, I actually lived with that person, and it was hard to kind of let go of some of the things that I was used to, like seeing them every day and, you know, talking to them, cooking for them, whatever I did for them. I had to not only let go of all of the stuff I was used to around my house, but I had to let go of the feelings that I had, and I took 2 weeks. Now, for some people that might be too short, for some people that might be too long, but for me, it worked to take 2 weeks to be sad, to be angry, to be everything I needed to be, so that I didn't deny myself those feelings. The second thing I did was, of course, I was honest with myself. And I was honest about the fact that I rushed that relationship. I saw something in him that I liked. I put expectations onto him, and I hurried up and jumped into this relationship without really truly seeing who he was. And that had a negative effect on us in the long term. Another thing I didn't do was I didn't set standards for myself on what I was willing to deal with and what I wasn't willing to deal with. So I basically gave him control of how that relationship was supposed to go. And because of that, I let things slide that didn't make me happy, but I let them slide because it worked for him at the time, and I missed out on the fun part of the relationship for myself in some aspects. Now, I was actually lucky that I got to have a third step, because he was willing to talk after the fact, somewhere down the line, about the relationship as a whole and what went wrong and everything. So when I got that opportunity, I went to him and I was direct and honest about how I felt. But I didn't just go there and point the finger at him and talk about what he did that hurt me. I also brought up the things that I mentioned in the second point was, you know, that I rushed the relationship. I also mentioned the fact that I didn't set standards, and I let the relationship, I let him hold everything. I let him hold all the cards. And when I wasn't happy, I just let that fall off my shoulders. And so I expressed to him how that negatively affected the whole situation as well. And that's because it wasn't about beating up on him. Like, at the end of the day, it took two of us to make that relationship not work. Granted, some of the things he may have done were harsher than some of the things I found out that I done, but I played my part. And I had to take ownership of that and let him know, like, no, what you did wasn't right, but I did kind of put myself in this situation, and this is how, so that we can build up a rapport and the healing can start. And we were able to walk away from that situation, you know, smiling and being able to move on with our lives. And that's what I wanted ultimately, which leads me into number 4. I forgave him and moved on. Now, understand what forgiveness means. It does not mean we became best friends, because that relationship was toxic and it was not worth me being your best friend after the fact. But it does mean that we can let go of that pain together, or that situation together, and move on with our lives with a clear start, you know? So when I saw him, I ended up seeing him years later at a restaurant. I was able to just say hello. He said hello, and we went our separate ways doing what we were doing. There was no bad blood. There was no looking at him crazy or starting no other stuff. I didn't care, because I had let go of that situation and I forgave him. Of course, I also did step number 5, which was be observant and learn from that situation. So somewhere between actually being able to talk to him about it and forgiving and letting go, I did take the time to break apart the relationship. And I remember some of the stuff that we did that I absolutely loved. Like, I remembered places we used to go, or how spontaneous we could be together, and all of that stuff was great. And I knew that it was something that I enjoyed. So in my next relationship, I definitely want to be able to experience those things. But I also took into account the things I didn't like. The fact that he would be flaky with what dates we would set up. The fact that everything revolved around him. The fact that whenever we had a conversation about our day, it always revolved around his day and mine was just a secondary thought. You know, those were the kind of things that I did not like. And so I was honest with myself about that in that time frame, and I learned that, okay, if I see these things happening in a relationship going forward, then I know, hey, I need to either speak up or I need to walk away. But I don't need to allow myself to continue in that relationship without acknowledging that these are things I don't like, you know. And then, of course, the last thing is I moved on. And when I did start dating again, because I didn't start dating right away, which is a personal choice, but for me, I like to give myself true time to heal, so that I'm not just trying to jump from one thing into another. I want to be fresh when I start something else. So when I did open the door to start dating again, I did not burden the new person with all of the issues that the last guy left me with. I gave him a chance to show me who he was. And if I saw patterns or things that I knew I wasn't a fan of because of what I learned from my previous relationship, I addressed them or I moved away from them. So like I said, the flakiness, if I noticed that a guy was making plans but they weren't sticking to them and they were being flaky about them, then I would bring that up. It's like, hey, if you want us to go out, then we can go out, but you're not going to say something and then not show up or not call or not follow through on the plans, because I don't want to deal with that. And if they couldn't meet me halfway, or not even meet me halfway, if they couldn't understand that and take that in consideration, then it was time for me to move on to somebody else. But I didn't come in disappointed or already thinking that they were going to do that. I let them show me that that's the path that they were on first. And then I took from that, like, hey, okay, I see this pattern. I've dealt with this before. I'm going to address it. And then if it doesn't change, then I need to go on by my separate ways. And all of that stuff helped me to be able to move on from that relationship. And I also used a similar method like that when it came to leaving my job when I was in Detroit. So, you know, and if you want to know about that, I do have a YouTube video about that on my channel where I talk about moving from Detroit to Vegas. So I said all of that to say, moving on, of course, is hard. And I'm not going to minimize it or say that it was easy for me. Even with those steps, I struggled through it. But it is possible and often necessary if you're in a toxic situation that does not help either person or does not change or support you in the situation, you need to learn how to let go in the best way possible. I am not a licensed therapist. I am not an expert in any of this stuff. These are just the things that help me to move on. And I encourage you to use them if they're helpful for you. But if they're not, then I encourage you to find your own way. But I do encourage you to figure out how to move on so that you can have the life you know you deserve. That is all I have for this To Be Fair Tuesday. I hope this was a helpful video. I know it was a little longer than usual, but I wanted to hit all these points because a friend of mine really wanted this video and I really wanted to give it to her. So thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Bye.